They laughed when the simple woman stepped into the mansion, but before the hour was over, every smile in that room would disappear. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Rain tapped softly against the towering windows of the Whitmore estate, tracing silver lines down the glass as luxury sedans filled the circular driveway one after another. Inside, the grand foyer glowed beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most families earned in a year. Marble floors reflected polished shoes, designer heels, and the restless movement of relatives who had not visited in years but had arrived precisely on time for one reason. Edward Whitmore, the steel magnate who had built an empire from a single machine shop in Ohio, was gone. And today his fortune would be divided. In the drawing room, voices floated like perfume and calculation. Cousins compared vacation homes. Nephews whispered about stock shares. Two sisters argued quietly over who deserved the lake house in Michigan. No one spoke of grief for more than a few seconds at a time. Mourning had become an accessory, worn neatly beside pearls and imported suits. At the center of it all stood Vanessa Holloway, Edward's niece by marriage, dressed in black silk tailored so sharply it looked expensive from across the room. Her blonde hair was pinned with effortless precision, and her smile carried the confidence of someone already spending money she did not yet own. She moved through the crowd greeting people with kisses that never touched skin, promising everyone fairness while imagining herself in control of everything. Then the front doors opened. A hush passed through the foyer as Clara Bennett stepped inside carrying a small umbrella still wet from the storm. She wore a plain navy coat, sensible flats, and a modest handbag faded at the corners. Rain had darkened a strand of chestnut hair near her cheek, but she did not rush to fix it. She simply closed the umbrella, thanked the doorman softly, and entered as though she belonged there more than anyone else. Vanessa turned, looked Clara up and down, and laughed once, sharp enough for everyone to hear. "Well, this is unexpected," she said. "I didn't realize today was open to the public." A few guests smirked behind lifted glasses. Someone near the fireplace murmured, "Who invited her?" Clara said nothing. Her eyes moved calmly across the room, taking in the portraits, the staircase, the faces pretending not to stare. She had walked these halls before when they were quiet, when no one else bothered to come. But that truth belonged to another time. Vanessa crossed the room, heels tapping like punctuation. "Clara, right? Edwards. What exactly were you? Assistant? Nurse? Companion?" The room leaned in. Clara met her gaze without hostility. "I was his friend," she answered. Vanessa smiled wider, the kind of smile that arrives before cruelty. "How touching. Well, family seating is reserved, so we'll have to find somewhere suitable." She gestured toward a narrow chair beside the door, half hidden behind a potted fern and a coat stand. There, perhaps. Easy access to the exit. Laughter rippled low and satisfied. Clara walked to the chair without protest and sat with quiet grace, folding her hands over her handbag. She did not defend herself. She did not plead. That unsettled some of them more than anger would have. Across the room, Attorney Harold Green adjusted the papers inside a leather folder and glanced toward Clara for a moment longer than anyone noticed. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 10. Conversations faded. Anticipation thickened the air. Vanessa settled into the front row, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. The air straightened. Pens were uncapped. Greed disguised itself as attention. And in the chair by the door, the woman they mocked sat perfectly still, as if she already knew something the rest of them did not. The room was about to learn that wealth can hide in silence just as easily as in gold. Harold Green rose slowly from the leather chair beside the fireplace, the kind of deliberate movement that commanded silence without asking for it. At 72, the Whitmore family attorney had spent 4 decades protecting contracts, settling disputes, and watching greed wear many elegant faces. He placed both hands on the mahogany table, looked over the room through rimless glasses, and waited until the final whisper died. "Thank you all for attending," he said in a measured voice. Mr. Edward Whitmore requested that his final instructions be read exactly as written, without interruption and without alteration. Vanessa leaned back with a satisfied smile. "Of course he did," she said lightly. Uncle Edward respected order. Harold did not acknowledge her. He opened the folder, removed a stack of cream-colored pages, and began. "To my family, friends, and those who have gathered here today, if you are hearing these words, then I have finally escaped your advice about diet, blood pressure, and succession planning." A few polite laughs moved through the room. Edward had always enjoyed sharp humor, especially when it made people uncomfortable. Harold continued reading smaller bequests first. A vintage watch collection to a nephew in Connecticut. A Napa Valley property to one sister. A charitable endowment of $2 million to a children's hospital in Cleveland. Jewelry, vehicles, art, and minority shares in several companies were assigned with careful precision. Each name called produced a subtle shift in posture, a hidden sigh of relief, or a disappointed tightening around the mouth. Vanessa received a sculpted bronze by a famous artist and $200,000 in cash. She smiled as if amused by how modest the gift seemed. Surely the real announcement was still coming. Across the room, Clara remained motionless in the narrow chair near the door. Her handbag rested on her lap, fingers folded gently over it. She listened not like someone waiting for wealth, but like someone listening to a familiar voice one last time. Vanessa noticed and laughed softly enough for others to join. "She is very attentive for someone with no stake in this," she murmured. A cousin replied, "Maybe she expects a fruit basket." More restrained. Laughter followed. Harold turned a page. The primary residence in Palm Beach was awarded to a trust pending sale. Several board seats would be dissolved and restructured. The family exchanged quick glances. That was unusual. Edward rarely left loose ends. Then came the private air service, divided among corporate holdings. Then the Manhattan penthouse, ordered sold with proceeds redirected to a scholarship foundation no one had heard of before that morning. Vanessa's smile began to fade by degrees so small only the observant would notice. "Excuse me," she interrupted, her voice still polished but tighter now. "There must be an addendum regarding executive control of Whitmore Holdings. Uncle Edward discussed transition plans many times." Harold lifted his eyes slowly. "Mrs. Holloway, your uncle also discussed patience many times." He returned to the document. "Please do not interrupt again." A ripple of restrained amusement passed through guests who were suddenly enjoying a shift in power. Harold continued. "Additional liquid assets will remain undistributed until the final section of this will is read in full." That sentence landed like a pebble in still water. Heads tilted. Pens paused. Vanessa straightened in her seat. "Final section?" she said before catching herself. Harold closed the current stack and reached into the folder once more. From inside, he withdrew a sealed envelope marked in bold handwriting. "To be opened last, in front of everyone." The room changed instantly. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. Harold held the envelope carefully, studying the familiar signature for a brief second. Edward anticipated confusion, he said. He also anticipated performance. Therefore, he left specific instructions that this final letter be read only after everyone received enough to reveal their true priorities. Several people looked down. Others pretended not to understand. Vanessa forced a laugh. Dramatic to the end. Harold slid a letter opener beneath the seal. Clara lowered her eyes for the first time all morning. Something in her expression was not fear and not surprise. It looked like memory. The envelope opened with a soft tear that sounded louder than thunder. Harold unfolded the letter with careful hands, and for the first time that morning even the people who loved to interrupt remained silent. His voice, steady and formal moments earlier, softened as he began to read. "If this room is quiet now, then I suspect money is involved." That was Edward Whitmore in a single sentence. Dry humor wrapped around uncomfortable truth. A few nervous smiles appeared and vanished just as quickly. Harold continued. "I spent my life building factories, negotiating contracts, and creating numbers large enough to impress strangers. Yet, in the final years of my life, when the doctors became honest and the nights became long, I learned something simple. Wealth cannot sit beside your bed at 2 in the morning. Wealth cannot notice when your hands shake. Wealth cannot ask whether you are afraid and wait for the real answer. Several eyes drifted downward. The chandeliers still glittered above them, but the room felt dimmer now. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other and tapped a manicured finger against her knee, impatience beginning to replace confidence. Harold turned the page. Many of you visited when calendars, photographers, or signatures were involved. Some of you sent flowers with cards written by assistants. Some of you discussed my condition loudly enough for the hallway to hear while asking whether the board had been updated. A cough broke out near the fireplace. Someone adjusted a tie that suddenly felt too tight. Clara remained still in the chair by the door, her gaze lowered to the umbrella beside her shoes. Harold's voice grew firmer. One person came when there was nothing to gain. One person arrived during snowstorms and summer heat. One person read to me when my eyesight failed, argued with me when I became stubborn, and laughed at me when I became dramatic. She brought soup in plain containers because hospital food was offensive to civilized life. She remembered the names of nurses everyone else ignored. She never once asked about my accounts, my holdings, or my will. A hush fell so complete the ticking grandfather clock sounded enormous. Vanessa straightened sharply. Her eyes moved across the room, calculating possibilities, and, finding none she liked, Harold looked over his glasses before reading the next line. That person is Clara Bennett. Several people turned so quickly toward the chair by the door that one guest nearly dropped a pen. Clara did not react. She simply lifted her eyes to Harold with quiet sadness, as though hearing the voice behind the words more than the words themselves. Vanessa let out a short laugh that cracked at the edges. "This is sentimental nonsense," she said. "Surely there are legal provisions after this tribute." Harold did not answer her. He continued, "To my family, understand this clearly. Blood introduced us. Character was meant to keep us together. Too often it did not. To Clara Bennett, who offered dignity when others offered schedules, I leave my gratitude, my trust, and the authority to decide what becomes of everything still remaining." Murmurs burst across the room like sparks. Harold raised a hand and silence struggled back into place. He read the final line slowly, each word landing where it could not be ignored. Therefore, all remaining shares of Whitmore Holdings, all unrestricted liquid assets, all undeclared properties, and controlling interest in every private account are hereby transferred solely to Clara Bennett. Vanessa stood so fast her chair scraped across marble. That is impossible. She was a caretaker. She was staff. She was nobody. Clara rose gently from her seat, smoothing the sleeve of her modest coat. No anger touched her face, only composure. "Edward never considered kindness to be nobody," she said quietly. The room went still again. In that mansion filled with inherited names and expensive confidence, the only person who seemed fully at peace was the woman they had seated beside the door. The silence shattered all at once. Voices rose from every corner of the drawing room, sharp whispers turning into open outrage as polished composure gave way to panic. A nephew demanded to see the documents. One of Edward's sisters insisted he had been manipulated. Someone near the windows muttered the word fraud loud enough for others to repeat it. In less than 10 seconds, grief had vanished completely, replaced by the raw sound of entitlement. Discovering it had lost. Vanessa stood rigid at the center of the storm, her face pale beneath flawless makeup. She stared at Clara as if the room itself had betrayed her. "This is absurd," she said, each word clipped and trembling with disbelief. "My uncle built this family legacy. He would never hand it to an outsider." Clara met her gaze without triumph. "Your uncle handed it to someone he trusted," she replied. "That is different." Vanessa laughed once, but there was no elegance left in it. "Trusted? You visited him in a hospital room and now you expect us to believe that makes you worthy of billions?" Harold Green closed the folder and spoke before Clara could answer. "Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Whitmore amended these instructions 18 months ago after a full legal review, independent witnesses, and medical certification of sound mind. The documents have already been filed with the court. Your disbelief changes nothing. The room went still for half a breath, then erupted again. A cousin began calculating aloud what controlling interest meant for the company. Another relative asked whether board appointments would be revoked immediately. Two guests who had ignored Clara all morning suddenly approached with sympathetic smiles and softer voices. Miss Bennet, one said, we never properly introduced ourselves. Another added, Edward always admired generous people. Clara recognized the speed of their transformation and found it almost sad. She gave them a polite nod and nothing more. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice into something meant to sound intimate. Clara, let us be reasonable. This is overwhelming for you. Estates this size are complex. Public pressure, regulators, media, shareholders. You are not prepared for any of that. If you sign temporary authority over to the family, we can help manage the burden. Clara's expression did not change. A moment earlier Vanessa had treated her like furniture. Now she spoke like a consultant offering rescue. The difference was not kindness. It was arithmetic. I managed Edward's medication schedule, appointments, charitable records, and private correspondence for 3 years, Clara said calmly. I think I can handle paperwork. Few people looked away to hide reluctant smiles. Vanessa's jaw tightened. You were an employee. I was his friend, Clara answered, and I listened when he spoke. Harold removed another envelope from the folder. There is also a memorandum regarding immediate governance changes. At Mr. Whitmore's request, effective today, 3 board seats are dissolved pending Ms. Bennet's appointments. Vanessa's hand flew to her chest. One of those seats was hers. Impossible, she whispered. Harold continued. Additionally, all discretionary household stipends funded through personal accounts are terminated this afternoon. That sentence struck harder than any raised voice. Phones appeared. Messages were sent in sudden urgency. A nephew quietly sat back down. Edward had supported more lifestyles than anyone realized. Clara looked around the room at the portraits, the marble, the expensive grief. She remembered bringing Edward soup in plain containers because he hated waste. She remembered him asking whether people would miss him or only his access. She had told him not to be cynical. Now she wondered if she had been too generous. Vanessa tried once more, this time with moisture gathering in her eyes. He was confused near the end. You know that. Clara's voice remained soft, but it carried farther than shouting. On his last Tuesday, he corrected your grammar, named the nurse from Denver, and asked why you only visited when cameras were present. No one moved. Vanessa froze mid-breath. The room had heard enough truth for one morning, and it had all come from the woman they seated beside the door. People reveal themselves fastest when the money stops moving. The room that had once treated Clara like an inconvenience now shifted around her like weather-changing direction. Voices softened. Smiles reappeared. Chairs were offered. A woman who had laughed at her coat minutes earlier now asked if she needed tea. Another relative complimented Clara's grace under pressure as if they had always admired it. Wealth had not changed hands yet, but loyalty already had. Clara stood near the fireplace while Harold organized documents on the table. The flames behind the iron screen cast warm light across her simple coat, and somehow she looked more composed than anyone dressed in silk or custom wool. Vanessa, however, was unraveling one polished layer at a time. She paced 3 steps, turned sharply, then paced back, the click of her heels no longer elegant but frantic. This cannot stand, she said. There are reputational issues. There are shareholders. There are expectations. Harold did not look up. There are signatures, witnesses, and binding law, he replied. Those usually matter more. A few suppressed smiles flickered through the room. Vanessa spun toward Clara. Tell them you do not want this. Tell them you know it belongs with family. Clara considered the woman in front of her, not with anger but with the calm attention one gives a puzzle already solved. Family is measured in many ways, she said. Mr. Whitmore chose his measurement carefully. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in years, words had failed her. Harold slid a second packet across the table. There is one remaining instruction from Mr. Whitmore, he announced. Ms. Bennet requested that it be withheld until emotions had introduced themselves. Several heads lowered. Harold broke the seal and read, "To Clara, if they become suddenly affectionate, remember they were distant when affection was free." A low murmur moved through the room. Even Clara allowed the smallest smile. Edward's humor had survived him perfectly. Harold continued, "Also, if Vanessa asks for control, tell her I already made my decision." A cousin coughed to hide laughter. Vanessa's face reddened. "This is cruelty," she said. "No," Clara answered gently. "This is memory." One by one, people began changing tactics. A nephew proposed strategic partnerships. An aunt suggested family healing dinners. A board member offered to mentor Clara through corporate transitions. Every sentence was wrapped in concern and tied with self-interest. Clara listened patiently, then asked a simple question. "How many of you visited him in the last 6 months?" Silence answered faster than honesty could. Rain continued tapping the windows. Somewhere deeper in the mansion, a clock chimed the quarter hour. The grand house seemed to be observing them all. Harold handed Clara a small brass key attached to a leather tag. "Mr. Whitmore asked that you receive this immediately. His private study. He said you would know what to do with it." Clara's fingers closed around the key, and for the first time emotion crossed her face. Not greed, grief. She remembered late evenings in that study, sorting letters for charities he secretly funded, listening to old jazz records, arguing with him about whether generosity should be public or private. He always claimed public generosity inspired others. She always claimed private generosity revealed character. Perhaps this morning had settled the debate. Vanessa saw the shift in Clara's eyes and tried one final approach. Her voice softened into something almost human. "Clara, I was upset. We all are. Let us start over." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Start over?" she said quietly. "That would require starting from sincerity." The room went silent again. Then Clara turned to Harold. "Please schedule a full audit of every stipend, board expense, and discretionary account. Effective immediately." Several people froze where they stood. Vanessa gripped the back of a chair. Clara added one final sentence in the same calm tone she had used all morning. "Mr. Whitmore disliked waste, and I intend to honor his wishes." Nothing unsettles opportunists like the word audit. The room that had buzzed with practiced confidence moments earlier now filled with private calculations and carefully hidden fear. Phones disappeared into pockets. Conversations ended mid-sentence. A board member who had been offering guidance suddenly remembered another appointment. One of Edward's nephews slipped quietly toward the hallway, only to stop when Harold Green looked up and said, "No one is being detained, but departures will be noted." The nephew returned to his seat immediately. Clara did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Calm authority has a way of sounding louder than panic. Harold arranged several folders into neat stacks and addressed the room. "Effective today, all discretionary transfers are paused pending review. Corporate reimbursements, household allowances, consulting retainers, and travel privileges funded through Mr. Whitmore's personal accounts are suspended until verified." A gasp escaped from Edward's younger sister before she could stop it. Vanessa turned sharply toward her. "Please do not embarrass us further," she hissed, then realized too late that everyone had heard. Clara watched in silence. It was remarkable how quickly people who called themselves family became strangers when invoices were involved. Harold continued reading from a prepared memo. "In addition, Ms. Bennet has authority to appoint interim governance advisors and request forensic accounting if necessary." Several heads snapped up at that phrase. Forensic accounting sounded expensive, thorough, and painfully honest. A man near the back cleared his throat. "Surely that will not be necessary." Clara glanced at him. "If everything was proper, then there is nothing to fear." He sat down without another word. Rain eased outside, leaving silver light across the windows. The storm had moved on. Inside the mansion, another one was just beginning. Vanessa approached Clara more slowly this time, no performance left in her posture. You are making a mistake, she said quietly. These people understand the company. They understand the circles Edward moved in. You do not. Clara held the small brass key in one hand, turning it once between her fingers. Perhaps, she said, but I understand promises, loyalty, and numbers that do not match receipts. Vanessa blinked. What does that mean? It means Edward noticed more than people assumed. Harold slid a thin folder toward Clara. He left notes, he said, marked for your eyes only. Clara opened it. Inside were pages in Edward's firm handwriting, dated over the last 2 years. Observations, concerns, names beside unexplained expenses. Luxury retreats billed as strategy sessions. Renovations charged to charitable accounts. Vehicles assigned to shell vendors. Clara looked up slowly. Edward had not been naive. He had been patient. Vanessa's face changed by degrees. She recognized at least one page from the expression alone. This is selective interpretation, she said. Harold adjusted his glasses. It is handwriting, dates, invoices, and bank records. Those are difficult to reinterpret. A hush fell over the room. Clara closed the folder carefully. For years, she had brought Edward tea while he complained about waste, vanity, and people who confused access with merit. She had thought some of it was bitterness from age. Now she understood he had been documenting disappointment. She addressed the room with the same gentle tone she had used all morning. No one will be humiliated today. Mr. Whitmore had enough of that while living. But accountability begins now. Relief crossed some faces. Fear deepened on others. Clara continued. If funds were misused, they will be repaid. If titles were ceremonial, they will be reconsidered. If loyalty was rented, it expires immediately. No one spoke. Even the grandfather clock seemed to wait. Harold then offered a final reminder. There is also the matter of the private study. Mr. Whitmore instructed that Ms. Bennet review its contents before any family claims are considered. Clara nodded and started toward the staircase. Vanessa stepped into her path, not aggressively, but desperately. Clara, please, at least tell me what you plan to do with everything. Clara paused on the first marble step and looked back at the room full of expensive uncertainty. The same room that had laughed when she arrived. Then she answered softly. First, I plan to learn who thought it was theirs. The room went silent once more as she climbed toward the study Edward trusted only her to open. The second floor of the Whitmore estate had always been quieter than the rooms below, but that morning it felt almost sacred. As Clara climbed the marble staircase, the arguments and whispers from the drawing room faded behind her until only the soft echo of her own steps remained. At the end of the hall stood Edward's private study, a walnut door few people had ever entered. Many in the family had spoken proudly of their closeness to him, yet most had never crossed that threshold. Clara slipped the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting for her hand. The room opened with the scent of leather, cedar, and old paper. Sunlight filtered through tall windows onto shelves lined with biographies, engineering manuals, and framed photographs no one downstairs had bothered to ask about. There was Edward at 25 in front of his first machine shop. Edward shaking hands with factory workers. Edward at a community center opening. And in several frames, quietly placed among them, Edward laughing beside Clara over coffee, cards, or a hospital chessboard. No grand displays, just ordinary moments. Clara closed the door gently behind her and stood still for a moment. This room had been where Edward spoke honestly. Here he admitted fears he never showed investors. Here he mocked people who praised him too quickly. Here he confessed that success had brought admiration, but not always affection. On the desk sat one final envelope, her name written in the same firm handwriting she had seen downstairs. She opened it carefully. Dear Clara, if you are reading this, then Harold followed instructions and the downstairs performance likely exceeded expectations. I apologize for the burden. I do not apologize for the lesson. Clara smiled through gathering tears. She continued reading. Inside the bottom drawer is everything you need to understand what they did, and what they thought I never noticed. Use it wisely. Also, The blue tin in the cabinet contains terrible cookies you always pretended to enjoy. Throw them away. She laughed softly into the empty room. Some people leave money. Edward had also left timing. Clara opened the bottom drawer. Inside were binders labeled by year, folders tagged with names, flash drives, and neatly stacked records. Expense reports, emails, signatures, offshore requests, duplicate invoices. The architecture of quiet theft. Vanessa's name appeared often. So did several others downstairs, now pretending shock. Edward had watched them take advantage of access while believing age had made him blind. Instead, it had made him patient. Clara sat in his chair and reviewed page after page. The numbers were staggering, but more revealing than the amounts was the arrogance. Vacation villas categorized as executive retreats. Personal stylists billed as branding consultants. Family travel disguised as philanthropic outreach. They had not only taken money, they had assumed no one worthy was paying attention. A knock came at the door. Harold entered after she answered. His expression was solemn but not surprised. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing her a warm mug of tea. He glanced at the open files and exhaled slowly. "So he kept everything." "He did." Harold nodded. "He once told me he was not waiting for revenge. He was waiting for clarity." Clara looked around the study again. Downstairs they wanted assets. Up here Edward had left responsibility. Harold placed another folder on the desk. One more instruction. If you chose to accept it. She opened it. It contained deeds, transfer papers, and a proposal drafted months earlier. Edward wanted 3 factories converted into employee-owned companies, a scholarship fund expanded nationwide, and the mansion turned into a public leadership institute after a 10-year term. Clara stared at the pages. "He planned all of this. He trusted only you to finish it," Harold said quietly. Below them, a sudden burst of voices rose from the drawing room, then stopped just as fast. Clara stood, gathered the folders, and wiped the last trace of emotion from her eyes. "Then let us finish it properly," she said. As she opened the study door, sunlight fell across the hallway, and for the first time that day, the woman they mocked no longer looked like a guest in the Whitmore house. She looked exactly like its future. When Clara descended the staircase, the room below did not look like a gathering anymore. It looked like a market after bad news. Conversations stopped the instant they saw the folders in her arms. Faces that had once carried effortless superiority now held something far less flattering. Uncertainty. Harold followed a few steps behind, calm as ever, carrying only a notepad and a pen. Clara reached the final step and crossed the marble floor without hurry. She placed the folders on the long table where Edward's will had been read, then looked around the room slowly. No one laughed this time. Vanessa stood near the fireplace with rigid posture, determined to appear composed despite the strain around her eyes. Several relatives avoided Clara's gaze entirely. Others tried to smile, hoping timing might still save them. Clara opened the top folder. "Mr. Whitmore left more than assets," she said. "He left intentions." Harold nodded for her to continue. "The first document concerns Whitmore Precision Manufacturing in Ohio," she said. "Effective immediately, ownership will transition over 3 years into an employee-owned structure. Senior workers with 10 years or more of service will receive priority shares." A man near the windows blurted out, "That plant was supposed to be sold." Clara turned one page. It was supposed to be protected. Edward changed his mind after learning the people discussing closure had never visited the factory floor. The man sat down. Clara opened the second folder. "The Palm Beach residence will be sold. All proceeds will fund the Whitmore National Scholarship Initiative for trade schools, nursing programs, and first-generation college students." Silence followed, but it was a different silence now. Even some who wanted money could not openly criticize scholarships. She continued, "The Manhattan penthouse will become housing grants for families of long-term hospital patients." Edward said no one should choose between rent and staying near someone they love. Harold lowered his eyes briefly. He remembered the hospital nights too. Vanessa stepped forward. "This is reckless philanthropy," she said sharply. "These properties represent family heritage." Clara looked at her with steady calm. Heritage without values is storage, she replied. A few heads turned away to hide reactions. Vanessa pressed on. And what exactly do you keep for yourself? Finally, there it was. The question beneath every other question. Clara closed the folder in front of her. Control of Whitmore Holdings remains with me for 10 years under Edward's plan. During that time, executive compensation will be capped, board attendance mandatory, and charitable commitments audited publicly each year. Several board members stiffened in their chairs. Then Clara added, after 10 years, this mansion becomes the Whitmore Leadership Institute for students from underserved communities. The room froze. Vanessa stared at the ceiling, the chandeliers, the portraits. Then, back at Clara as if language itself had betrayed her. You are giving away everything, she whispered. No, Clara answered. I am putting it where it can breathe. Harold handed Clara one final page. She read it aloud. To those upset by these decisions, I remind you that I earned it, and therefore I choose it. Signed, Edward Whitmore. A low sound moved through the room, part surrender, part disbelief. Clara then opened the smallest folder. There remains one personal matter. Misused discretionary funds identified in preliminary records total $4,800,000. Repayment plans will be arranged privately beginning this week. Several people went pale. Vanessa's hand gripped the mantle behind her. You would humiliate us publicly? She asked. Clara's voice softened. Public humiliation was this morning when you mistook kindness for weakness. Accountability is different. No one defended Vanessa. No one defended themselves. The alliances of convenience had dissolved. Clara gathered the folders and looked around the room one final time. Edward once told me money is loud when it arrives and silent when it leaves, she said. Today I learned character works the same way. The room stood motionless as the woman they mocked reorganized an empire with the same calm grace she had used to fold an umbrella at the door. By late afternoon, the storm had passed and sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, revealing every detail the gray morning had hidden. Dust on forgotten portraits, fine cracks in old marble, faces that had spent years polished by privilege and were now stripped bare by disappointment. One by one, the relatives began to leave. Some offered stiff goodbyes. Some said nothing at all. Others attempted final smiles that reached nowhere near their eyes. Luxury cars rolled down the circular drive carrying people who had arrived expecting inheritance and departed with invoices, obligations, and silence. Vanessa remained longer than the rest. She stood alone near the fireplace where she had once commanded the room. Her posture still elegant but diminished somehow, like a performance after the audience has gone home. Clara was at the long table reviewing transition notes with Harold when Vanessa approached. There was no anger left in her voice now, only fatigue. I underestimated you, Vanessa said quietly. Clara looked up. No, she replied. You underestimated kindness. Vanessa exhaled, glancing toward the staircase, the chandeliers, the carved ceilings she had imagined controlling. I thought money meant certainty. Clara closed the folder in front of her. Money often rents certainty. It rarely owns it. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Vanessa asked the one question pride could no longer stop. Did he ever speak well of me? Clara considered the answer carefully. He said you were intelligent, ambitious, and capable of doing real good if admiration ever stopped distracting you. Vanessa's eyes lowered. It was the first honest mirror anyone had held before her in years. She nodded once, whispered thank you, and walked out through the front doors without looking back. Harold watched her leave. People can change, he said. Sometimes after consequences. Clara smiled faintly. Then perhaps there is hope for everyone. The next weeks moved quickly. News spread that Whitmore Holdings would remain private under new stewardship. Markets expected chaos and found discipline instead. Executive waste was cut. Scholarships were announced. Factory workers in Ohio received letters confirming ownership pathways and job security. Families near major hospitals learned housing grants were opening. Employees who had feared layoffs found themselves invited into planning meetings for the first time. Reporters requested interviews. Clara declined most of them. She preferred action to cameras, a habit Wealth had not changed. Months later, on a clear autumn morning, the Whitmore mansion hosted a different gathering. No jewel-toned gowns. No whispered greed. The ballroom was filled with students, apprentices, nurses, mechanics, and young entrepreneurs from neighborhoods Edward had never forgotten and society often had. Banners along the walls read Whitmore Leadership Institute. Harold, now officially retired, stood beside Clara near the entrance. Edward would have hated the banner font, he murmured. Clara laughed. Softly, he would have written 3 letters about it. The first class of scholarship recipients entered carrying notebooks and nervous hope. A young woman from Detroit planned to study engineering. A father of 2 from Kansas was beginning nursing school at 41. A quiet teenager from Arizona had won seed funding for a small manufacturing startup. They walked through doors once guarded by status and entered as owners of their future. Clara stepped to the podium only because Harold insisted someone had to welcome them. She looked across the room and thought of the narrow chair by the door where she had been placed months earlier. Then she spoke. This house once held many conversations about who deserved opportunity, she said. Starting today, we answer that question